All right, I'm Davis Hunt, your host of editor-in-chief of the Pamphleteer and your host of Office Hours, our weekly show. I'm sitting here with Aaron Renn, writer and consultant based in Indianapolis. Aaron has also worked with the Manhattan Institute and governing uh, before. So we're Aaron is here at for part two of our city symposium, in which we discuss issues affecting cities and eventually we'll draw the conversation around to the particular issues facing Nashville. The first part of this, I talked to Nolan Gray about his book, Undivided. What's the name of it? Arbitrary Lines. Aaron, I'm sure you read that?
Nolan's great.
Yeah, Nolan is great. I we'll get into yes, Nolan's great. I honestly went into the conversation with him, kind of anticipating disagreeing with him on a lot of stuff. His book's very compelling. So anyway, so Aaron, we brought you on. You're the second wing of the city symposium, so I figured we'd just get into it. Start out. What do you think are the main problems facing American cities?
To me, the biggest issue facing American cities is undoubtedly the decline of civic leadership culture and institutional capacity. This is a result of many factors, but one of them is the way that the decline of old money elites and consolidation of industries took away the old sort of local power brokers who used to run things. So, if you listen to the critics, you will hear that in the old days, it was a group of, about 10 old white guys that sort of ran everything in town. And that's true. And that had a lot of negative results in terms of not being inclusive of, their community. They often just ran roughshod over other people. Sometimes they made stupid decisions. On the other hand, they could get things done. They could actually make decisions. These were people who were confident in their ability to lead and direct and steer the community. And you could think of it as someone like a bank president. So back in the 1980s, before bank mergers and consolidations, pretty much every city in America had its three big banks, and the head of the biggest local bank in town was the biggest power broker. And his bank probably didn't have many branches outside of the city it was located in, if any, because American banking really didn't allow that until the 1980s. And so the only way for the president of the local bank to get personally rich was for his bank to do well. And the only way for his bank to do well was for the community to grow and fuel additional deposits and demands for loans. So there was alignment between the interest of the civic elite and the city and the kind of the prosperity of the community as a whole. Well, today that's not the case. The banks have all been bought out for the most part. So the head of the local, national bank that happens to have a network in Nashville is just essentially a bureaucrat.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a corporate relations, government relations person who's sent there to sort of serve on the chamber board and things like that. They're not from here. They're not going to stay here. They have no clout. They're not rich. If they say the wrong things, they lose their job. And so what you end up with is a very timid, very bureaucratized leadership class. And again, it's also been a greatly expanded leadership class, which we think of as good in many ways. There are more people with a seat at the table. But when the people who are really stakeholders, go from 10 to 15 to 50 to 150, it's a lot harder to come to conclusions. And so I think there's been a tremendous loss of civic leadership capacity, and we just simply have weaker, much more timid leaders in our cities than we had 30 years ago. And this is why there's been a persistent inability to address many of these problems. It's also why basically the same solutions are proposed everywhere in every city.
Yeah.
There's an old saying back in the day that nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. That is, if you just bought an IBM mainframe, even if it was a disaster, you went with the incumbent, you went with the big dog, you couldn't get in trouble. Well, today it's the same thing. People go with the safe solution. There's absolutely no incentive to color outside the lines. Most people are always very careful never to say anything that would cross the sort of elite urban progressive consensus. And so you have essentially kind of very monolithic leadership as well, not much public dissent, and a whole host of problems that aren't being addressed, and many opportunities that are sort of left on the table because people aren't willing to order off the menu, so to speak. That to me is the root cause underlying many of the challenges that we have that we can't seem to be able to deal with.
That's not at all. That was very compelling answer to that, and something that I've thought myself, but not at all what I thought you were going to say.
Right. It's and that was not necessarily a commentary on Nashville specifically. That's a general statement.
Yeah.
Although probably you do have a lot of the national banks, and there's been some corporate consolidations, but there may still be some old money families and power brokers around as well. So I don't know that that has been totally eliminated there, but it has been most likely dramatically reduced from what it was in the past.
Very much so. Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of, I don't know. I'd never heard anyone else say that. So
yes, it's that's actually a pretty short synopsis of something that I've written about extensively over the years. I really think bank mergers, the taking away the restrictions on bank branching and mergers that happened in the 1980s and 1990s was really a very negative event for cities because it sort of decimated genuine local elites. Mm-hmm. And it's not just banking that's happened to. It's happened in utilities. It happened in retail. It happened in media. It used to be a lot of times there was one local family who owned the local newspaper. Maybe they owned a TV or radio station along with it, depending on when they bought it, because there's some regulations around that. And today they're all owned by Gannett or some private equity firm. And, the children or grandchildren of the local guy who owned the paper now live in New York or San Francisco. They're long gone.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. It's like the children of today's elites in a place like Nashville are probably going off to Harvard or Yale or Stanford or something like that, and then they're going to move to the coast. They're not sticking around. That's even true in New York. And sometimes it's not exactly advertised that many of these people are not around as much as they used to be, which is true even of the power brokers themselves sometimes. But that's a big issue. What you see in Indianapolis is most of the people who staff civic organizations now are people like me. They came from small towns in Indiana or Illinois or Iowa or wherever. They moved to Indianapolis, and now they've moved into these positions of leadership. They're people in the make. It's not like the son of the third generation of the banking heirs. Those old people are gone, and so it's sort of R of East type people, much more timid. It's like people like me. I don't have a lot of clout. I don't have an ability to throw my weight around, and so it's just a very different leadership environment.
Yeah. That's something I've observed in Nashville. Is most of the people that get involved in city government, it's like they move to Nashville and they like in searching for a community or a purpose within the city, they get involved in civic government, run for council, go and work for the Metro Housing Department or whatever that may be. But it's a distinct type of person that pursues those roles that is maybe, I was not alive 50 years ago, but I imagine that knowing some of the people that I know that have been involved in city government that are older now and them having been here for a while, it's just a different type of person that gets involved in city leadership. And a lot of them don't understand the area that they're even purporting to lead.
Right.
So yeah, that's interesting. One thing that you said there was this kind of one size fits all solutions that are being blanket applied to all cities. And that's something I have a hard time verbalizing because defining a distinction between, say, Nashville and a place like Indianapolis or a place like Atlanta is difficult to do. And maybe the best example of that is how the roads are set up in Nashville. And the easiest thing to talk about would be the idea of like applying a mass transit plan to Nashville. And I was reading about you writing about Indianapolis's bus transit plan where they took, I don't know what the old plan looked like, but the way you made it sound was that they took an existing spoke and wheel system and gridified it. I don't know if that's the right term, but they made it something like that. Yeah.
I wouldn't be too grandiose about it. They've made baby steps in the direction of improving transit here. We've built one bus rapid transit line is in service. The second one is under construction, opens next year, and there's a third one that's probably going to happen, but it's not 100% happen. That's our kind of east-west one. It's still a basically hub and spoke system, but we've tried to be more of a little bit more towards a grid on transit. Transportation is one where a city like Nashville really does need to think differently. So basically, there's a few things to keep in mind. Nashville is basically an overgrown small town. Indianapolis is as well. I mean, if you go to Nashville, it wasn't that big that long ago. Nashville was a much smaller city when the freeway system was laid out, for example. So if you go back to Indianapolis, we were a little bit bigger city than Nashville back then. I think you've probably passed us up because you're growing a lot faster.
700,000 now.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not about the region. But the key is, most cities the size of Indianapolis had all these freeways that came in. It was sort of a hub and spoke system, but they also had a beltway around downtown. Columbus, Ohio has one. Cincinnati has one. Dallas has a couple. Houston has 3. So you have these beltways. And Nashville was never built with a proper beltway. It's got this weird sort of interconnect of freeways downtown with all this branching and merging.
Yep.
The second thing, so it was really an undersized and poorly designed freeway system for a city that's much smaller, much larger today than it was when it was designed. A city like Charlotte, which was in a similar situation, Charlotte bit the bullet and actually built a beltway in the 2000s at a very high cost. They have a lot of toll roads in North Carolina too, by the way. So that's one. The other thing is the roads in the South are laid out very different than the roads in the rest of the country. When the Northwest Ordinance was passed, basically it was surveyed. The land was all going to be surveyed on a 1-mile grid, the township system that they call it. And so in essence, in most of the country, there is a roughly 1 square mile grid of roads in these counties. And so there's north, south, and east, west roads on a sort of grid at large scale. In the South, it wasn't surveyed that way. I don't know all the history, but cities in the South tend to be very radial, and you have these pikes that come in and out of downtown. And all of the development is along the pikes, and very little of it is kind of, there are a few cross-town routes. There aren't a lot of ways to go cross-town. And so that's the case in Atlanta, for example. Basically, you have to get on the perimeter to basically go circumferential in Atlanta. And that's one reason the perimeter traffic is so bad. There just really aren't a lot of roads that allow you to go cross town. Where here in Indianapolis, there's tons of cross town roads. I live in the suburbs here. Hamilton County would take 96th Street, 116th Street, 146th Street, State Road 32. There's a whole network of essentially crosstown routes, often very busy. Same thing was true in Chicago, where I lived. And so what you end up with is a situation where it's sort of easier to go in and out of downtown, very hard to go between nodes that are not downtown. So just as one example, if you think of I-65 going south of the city, down to Franklin and beyond, and you think of I-24 going out to Murfreesboro to the southeast, between Old Hickory Road and I-840, there are no direct roads connecting I-65 and I-24. Yeah. So that's a 15-mile stretch where there's no way to get between those two freeways.
Right.
And so if you have to go from somewhere, on the I-65 corridor, if you had to go from Cool Springs to Smyrna, you're in a world of hurt. Right. And it's not easy to get there. And so and one of the results is, if you look at the data from the University of Minnesota, Nashville has one of the lowest share of jobs in its region accessible to the average commuter within 30 minutes because it's not easy to get around in Nashville. The traffic is extremely bad there. And so that's one thing. So you had essentially the fact that Nashville was much smaller when its highway system was designed. You have this sort of southern roadway pattern, which is basically primed to create high congestion and difficult to get around cities. And then you get the point where, again, part of the part of it being an overgrown small town is most of the roads in Nashville don't even have sidewalks. I mean, my one friend moved to an area just south of downtown. He can walk to the center of town. It's 2 miles, and his road that he lives on has no curbs, no sidewalks, and drainage ditches, and nowhere to park. And it's 2 miles from the center of town.
Wow.
There's the stat, maybe right around the time of the last transit referendum. Maybe it's improved a little bit, but probably not much. That only 37% of the streets in Nashville have sidewalks. So you start combining all of these things together. Nashville has major transportation problems, and it's not going to be solved easily, simply. Maybe a lot of it can't be solved. But the school solution, which was tried before, is let's build a $10 billion light rail system. That light rail system is probably going to be deemed to be a success because probably some people will ride it, and there will probably be development along it because there's development everywhere. I mean, Nashville's just booming. It's going to boom whether you put a light rail in or not. If you build a light rail, you claim that the boom was caused by the light rail and you claim it was a great success. It's not going to have any positive impact on traffic, and and it's just going to be a rounding error. And it's not going to be a transit-oriented city because you don't have sidewalks to get anywhere once you get off your transit line. So I think that it's going to be complicated. There's a lot of the basics that aren't taken care of. We just got to have sidewalks. We have to have multi-use paths or bike lanes or what people are doing today. We have to have, enclosed drainage on some of the streets. We probably need to, improve transit in some way, but not a $10 billion system to start off. Probably something along the lines of a bus rapid transit system where the transit project also pays to redo one of these pikes or some of the streets that it runs on into a proper modern urban street. And that's something you're gonna have to look at. And you probably also, the truth is, the state of Tennessee, this wouldn't be a local thing. The state of Tennessee could easily put $10 billion into highways and freeways. It's very unpopular to say that you might want to do that. But even in Austin, Texas, the state of Texas is going to spend $8 billion or so widening I-35 through town. They have similar problems. And so, again, it's one of these things where you got the kind of the activist class that will tell you we can't have anything that accommodates cars. Everything has to be transit. Nashville is not a city that's primed to become a rail transit success in the near term. But there's big problems with the infrastructure across every dimension, pedestrian, bike, transit, roads, and they all need to be addressed and improved in some way. So that's an example of the leadership class of the city is never going to address that because it requires thinking about Nashville in the context of what I just told you, all these unique elements about Nashville. And I mean, I didn't even get to all of it, and I'm not even a super in-depth person. That's just me looking at a map and driving around. I'm told the area maybe to the west or northwest of town is less developed because it's this super hard rock that's almost impossible to blast through. And so therefore you can't really build. So there's a lot of things like that you have to take into account.
Northwest part of town is what you're,
Yeah. And so you start looking at it and say, wow, we have to think about doing something here that's different and more creative than what's been done in some of these other places like Portland, Oregon, or San Francisco. We just can't copy everybody else's ideas. We have to come up with some solution that works for this city. I just think that's very difficult to do. I'm not optimistic that Nashville's traffic problems and transportation problems are going to improve materially anytime soon. Not just because it's growing, because I see no evidence that anyone's going to address it.
I don't. How could you address it though? Because what you just laid out about the spoke and wheel stuff, and there not being crosstown routes and all that is very true. I happen to live on one of these, fairly robust crosstown routes, Woodmont that turns into, Woodmont that turns into, if you're familiar, to Harding eventually. And Thompson Lane, or Woodmont turns into Thompson.
I know Harding. That's what it's about. Yeah.
Harding's a little more like one layer out.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, how would you even address that? The mayor that just got elected ran on this very transit forward platform, and he's done since he's taken office, they've made changes to the rapid bus system. They're expanding that. They're building this big new transit center in North Nashville. it's still kind of predicated on this like spoke and wheel system where you have to go downtown basically to where they're building 3 hubs down there. And if you want to get across town, you have to go interchange at a hub and to get over to the other side of town because of all the problems you're talking about. There's not a whole lot of
Right.
cross town routes. I mean, how would you even where do you even start trying to realistically address that if not just expanding the bus lines?
In a town like Nashville, probably the radial system that's hub and spoke is probably going to stay that way for a while.
Right.
You might want to incrementally build on it over time. I think improving some of those to bus rapid transit in ways that enable you to redo some of these streets to be the way that they should be designed, and then doing a whole lot of sidewalk construction to enable the neighborhoods to connect to it. And again, obviously, you need to do some correct zoning along that route so that you can have the development that's along it. That's all stuff I support. That would be sort of standard solutions that I think would work well. And you could probably, with some of these bus rapid transit, you might be able to pull in 50% federal funding on it. It's actually pretty capital efficient. The first line that was done here in Indianapolis, which has a lot of exclusive lanes, was $100 million. And most of that again went to the streets. It didn't actually go for the bus or the stations. It went for, we have to replace the stoplights. We have to put in new sidewalks. We have to deal with drainage. So it was a little bit of a pretext, if you will, to upgrade the streets, which I can understand. If you're a transit advocate, you're not going to like that. But also realistically, there's no money to upgrade the streets in most of these places. And so that's one of the things you got to do.
Do you ride the bus in Indianapolis?
I don't typically. I moved to the suburbs in January, and my first time really living in a genuine suburb, which is kind of interesting. So the bus doesn't come out here. But when we lived downtown, we definitely rode the bus. I've ridden the bus a number of times. But for me, I could walk to work in Indianapolis. And then during the pandemic, of course, it was work from home. I actually lived in New York City, Manhattan, before I moved back here at the end of 2019. And prior to that, I lived in Chicago for about 20 years. So I know what it is like to ride transit. I mean, I'm a very heavy transit rider.
Mm-hmm.
I've probably spent 8 years of my adult life plus outside of college, forget college for a minute, 8 years of us without a car. I lived in multiple places in Chicago without a car. Obviously, didn't have a car in Manhattan. I love riding trains. I love transit. I take the Amtrak back and forth to DC or to Philadelphia or to Boston all the time when I lived in New York. I love riding trains. I'm very pro train. I'm not one of these people that hates it. But I also have lived in environments where, transit actually makes sense. And I understand what it means to have like a real transit city. And, even Chicago is not quite there in terms of like living without a car. It's inconvenient to not have a car in Chicago. You limit yourself in what you can do. Only New York is really a place where, the transit is dominant in terms of a way to get around. Transit, walking, etc. Even the biggest of the other cities are not quite there yet.
San Francisco is you can live in San Francisco without a car. I lived in the Bay Area and briefly in San Francisco. Yep. When I was in the Bay, it was I didn't have a car for about a year, and then I got a car out there, and everything was much easier with a car. But when I was in San Francisco, you can get around without it. That's about my only experience living in a city without.
I've ridden a lot of transit in San Francisco, and it depends on where you want to go. That's the other thing. It's like if you want to go up and down where one of the lines runs, it's great. If you want to go from here to there, it might not be quite so good. But San Francisco again would be one of the handful of cities that's
right.
Pretty serious about transit. Nashville is one of the fewest transit riders in the country. I mean, the idea that you're going to, transform that, you're going to go from like worst to first by spending $10 billion or something. It ain't going to happen.
No, I don't even think I knew. I grew up here. I don't even think I knew the bus existed. And the running joke for most people that grow up here is that, I mean, unless you grew up in North Nashville, the poorer part of town where people tend to not have vehicles as frequently, but like car ownership rates here, I think is second highest in the country. And like Memphis, Memphis and Nashville are the two highest car dependent cities, most car dependent cities in the country. Like I think I read something about you maybe being here or somewhere else, like driving 2 blocks to go to a restaurant, and
Now, that was
that's
in Indianapolis. I mean, we're right up there. We have one of the worst levels of transit ridership in the country. Like, I think less than 1% of people commute by transit here. It's
right.
very, very low. But I mean, the truth is, there aren't very many cities in America. There are 10 or fewer cities where even 5% of the people get a commute by
Yeah,
transit. It's, you get out of New York and it falls off quick. I think there are only 6 cities in America where more than 10% of the people commute by transit. And again, when I say city, I'm talking about metro area. And yeah, Nashville is very car dependent, and it was built to be car dependent.
mm,
It's and that's part of it. New York, it was built in the pre-automobile era. It was built around trains. It was built around these lines. Some of the subways and things were built by real estate developers. In Chicago, I think it was the Green Line was basically built by real estate developers who wanted to open up land to development, so they had to get a train to go downtown. So it's completely different. It's completely different today when you have a sort of automobile oriented city. And remarkably little historic urbanization in Nashville.
right.
I mean, you get outside of downtown, there's essentially nothing. And
No.
there's a couple nodes here and there. Again, sort of like Indianapolis. It's not like even like a place like Cincinnati has 30 something urban commercial districts in the city. That's just not the case in Cincinnati. Most of the stuff that's a little more urban is stuff that's been built pretty recently.
Do you see there being any cultural movement that where people actually choose to ride transit more? Or I mean, the way that I would frame it is that as people get, it seems to me in a lot of ways like a means to make people comfortable with impoverishment, not being able to afford a car. So it's like riding the bus is all right.
I've
Do you
always
see?
said that about this millennial idea of like the sharing economy and I'll ride a bike
Right.
or, things like that. I mean, a lot of the millennial urban lifestyle, which was heavily subsidized by venture capital, by the way, which has been written about a lot. A lot of that millennial urban lifestyle to me did seem like a little bit of trying to glamorize the fact that you could never afford a car and you couldn't afford
Yeah.
to own it
Yeah.
all. You couldn't afford to own a condo or an apartment or a house.
Yes.
And you're sort of portraying a little bit of your downward mobility as sort of the lifestyle that you aspire to live,
Hmm.
because millennials actually did okay in terms of income. I think they've and millennials are actually coming along really really well as a generation right now. For a long time, it's like, yeah, I make a pretty good income, but the prices in these cities have gone up so much
Yeah.
that the price is insane to live. And so the price of living in a New York or a San Francisco or a Seattle, and probably even in Nashville, has gone up faster than the income. And so you want to live in one of these places and you're there. Like, I can't really afford to own the car. I do think there's some of that. Um, so there are people such as myself who like to ride transit, who like to ride trains. Um, and again, obviously we've done it enough that my son sometimes says, "Can we go ride the bus?" And so my wife will usually take him when I'm doing something else and take him into the city, and they'll get on the bus and they'll go for a bus ride because he loves riding the bus. So
Yeah.
maybe he'll grow up loving the bus. I don't know. So there are some of us that like transit, but I think the reality is, it's really nice when you have a car, especially when it's
Yeah.
raining or it's cold, and you can just get in there and you can just drive and you can go where you want to go, and you have to wait for the schedule, and it's so much faster in almost every case that it's hard to make the case for transit in a lot of these cities at scale. But I do think we need to be, incrementally improving and building up. I do think there's a sort of social justice issue around transit. There are a lot of people that can't afford cars. There's people who have
Hmm.
disabilities. There are people who aren't able to drive for a variety of reasons, and they need to get around. And so we need to make sure that we do have a baseline adequate system. And I think that we can attract some more choice riders. The Red Line bus rapid transit that we built here, is attracting a very diverse mix of riders and seems to be well patronized. And so, we're still having some reliability issues and kind of staffing and other things, but I think it's been, I would call it pretty much of a success. And it has attracted a lot of people who probably otherwise would not have ridden transit. And that starts migrating things in the, in the, in the right direction, from a transit perspective.
Culturally in Nashville, like East Nashville, people probably ride the bus more than West Nashville and South Nashville people, which tends to be, East Nashville tends to be a little more politically progressive. And that's where you get a lot of the pro-transit energy. But the most trafficked bus lines are over in that part of town. And I don't know, it's kind of interesting to think about the city kind of splitting where, there's a community around, I think the Murfreesboro Pike in Nashville line, the 77, I can't remember what number it is. I never ride the bus here, to be clear, so I just try to digest the information as it comes out, and so that I can at least get the impression of understanding what's going on with it. But I don't know, it's interesting to think about parts of town developing as like bus-centric communities and the rest of the town kind of staying car-centric. It seems like that's the way Nashville's heading. Like the east part of town is going to get a lot of bus development, rapid transit lines expanding, that kind of thing. West side of town, I don't see that happening as much.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, for the most part, if you live in a proper urban neighborhood, you're primarily walking everywhere for your daily needs. You can
Right.
walk to the coffee shop, walk to a grocery store. You should be able to walk to a library branch. You should be able to walk around and not have to
Yeah.
get on transit to deal with your daily needs or get in a car. It's when you want to go someplace out of your neighborhood that transit comes into play. And it most commonly comes into play for people who are commuting somewhere, commuting downtown to work. Well, now with remote work, hybrid work, there's less commuting going on. And every transit system in America is struggling with significantly decreased ridership and fiscal problems.
Right.
And so I don't know Nashville, but the vast majority of cities the size of Nashville actually don't collect much in fares. The fares are sort of just nominal. It's almost entirely tax subsidized. I think here in Indianapolis, 20% or less of the cost of the system, that's just operating costs for capital costs, come from fares. So we can afford to lose a lot of fare money and it won't affect service. Get to a place like Chicago, where by law they need to get 50% of their operating revenue from fares. When people stop riding the system, that's a problem. And so, I think with the, work from home and the different kind of work scenarios, we really haven't seen how that's going to play out, in terms of how it's going to affect transit demand. If you're working at home or in a co-working space in your neighborhood, you don't really need to commute. You might not really need a car for all that much. Maybe you're not a no car person, but you're a one car family. We live in the suburbs. We're a one car family, in part because, I work from home. And, then let's just say, on Friday or Saturday night, you go out, maybe you Uber it. So, or maybe you take a bus to get to a club to hear a band. Cause you don't mind taking the time to get there, and then at night you Uber home. So there's different ways to think about how the lifestyle you might want to live. But if you're constantly having to ride transit, it probably means in part that your neighborhood doesn't have everything that you need right there.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've got a grocery store probably an eighth of a mile from my house, but I have to walk over a major 5-lane road that's packed all day. And, for some reason that crossing that road is just enough of a mental barrier for me to not walk over there.
Right.
Sometimes I'll bike over there if I've got just like a little errand to run. I'll just bike and then bike back. But walking is like out of the question. There's not a sidewalk to get down to the major throughway to White Bridge, and crossing it, I might die realistically.
Right.
Like there's one crosswalk without lights. Like it would be foolish of me to.
Right. I mean, those are the things that you got to fix before you can even think about transit.
Right.
Oh, I don't have a sidewalk to get there. Like if you can't walk to the grocery store a quarter mile from your house, like a 5-minute walk from your house, how in the heck are you going to like create a real trans-orient city?
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so those are the sorts of things that like you don't have the basics in place, and you want to build a Rolls-Royce transit system.
Yeah.
There's something a little off about that. But it's one of these things where like it's a competitive thing too. It's like, you have a $700 million convention system. Well, convention center. Well, I'm going to build $1 billion convention center.
Yeah.
So it's sort of an arms race, and cities can brag, at the Bloomberg City Lab conference about how much money they're spending on transit. If Austin's going to spend $10 billion on transit, we got to spend $10 billion on transit too, or nobody's going to think we're a world-class city or something like that. So I think there's a certain keeping up with the Joneses. Again, it's all groupthink. Everything is groupthink. Probably, I mean, I hate to sound like a cynic, but the reality is a lot of these people have probably never expressed like an independent thought about what a city ought to be. They're just reading off a standard menu of choices. Now, again,
correct.
A lot of the choices on the menu are good choices. I'm not saying it's a bad menu, that all the options are bad. But like, what are you doing that's not totally superficial that's there? Now, I will say Nashville has been better than most places at understanding that it needs to market itself as distinct. Mm-hmm. I've always observed that while every company tries to convince you of how much different and better it is than every other company in its industry, every city tries its hardest to convince you that it is exactly the same as every other city that's conventionally considered cool. I think about the old Apple ad campaign, think different. And Nashville, I think, has done a little bit of a good job of that. You've tried to think, okay, country music, we're going to be the country music people. Although for a long time, the city really didn't think much about country music, didn't really like country music.
Lamar Alexander has that famous quote that it went like country music and Nashville went together like KFC and Japan.
Right. Yeah. And so wanted to be the Athens of the South, had these kind of, I think there's a little bit of this idea that Nashville really leaned into country music, I think is probably a little bit of a myth. My understanding, when I come down there and I talk to some of the older people, is it just kind of got too big and it just kind of took off on its own.
Yep.
But this idea that, hey, yeah, we're gonna embrace that. The reality is like country music is not. There's not a lot of people listening to country music in San Francisco and New York. Okay, just to let you know. This is not something that is really like hip cool among the elite necessarily. Now, definitely Nashville has blitzed up country a lot. It's not the old school country. It's definitely much more sophisticated. There's been a lot of crossover artists, like, of course, Taylor Swift, all these things. Nevertheless, having the courage to do that is important. And really, so that was one. I think scouring around, like, what can we find that's local here that we can do? I think Nashville hot chicken, it was like another one, One of my friends grew up in Nashville. He's like, I grew up, I've lived in Nashville my whole life through the 1990s. Like, I never heard of Nashville hot chicken.
Neither had I. Neither had I. Like,
it's like nobody was like, they were like, it was served in like 3 places in
Prince's and
black neighborhoods. And so it probably was a thing in, maybe the black community of Nashville, which is great. But you found that there was this little thing and turned it into a national sensation.
Yeah.
Which I think, Nashville has done a really good job of finding that. What is something that we've got that we could somehow turn into another unique thing about Nashville? And so there are some cities, Las Vegas is obviously very unique, New York. Nashville has done better than the average city by a mile by willing to brand itself around things that other people have not branded itself around. And now I want to see if they can do it on the policy front.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. It does feel like a little bit like city leadership is out of tune with what you just said, because Nashville has branded itself very specifically in this way that's unique from other cities. And it's, unlike Atlanta or Charlotte or Indianapolis, it does have this cultural presence that's really global at this point. I mean,
absolutely.
I was in Melbourne.
Making TV shows about your city. You made it for real.
Yeah. Now. Yeah. Well, they had, ATL there, but I was in Melbourne a couple years ago, just walking around, I don't know, some part of Melbourne, and I stumbled upon like a Nashville hot chicken. This was in 2019 19, and I was just blown away. I was like, wow, I had no idea that I'm sure
I
this
won't
was
swear to
probably.
this, but I think avocado toast came from Melbourne. That may have been where they
I
invented
That sounds
avocado.
about
It's
right.
got avocado toast.
So
Yeah,
they're
so
responsible for breaking all the millennials' wallets, right?
yeah, exactly. No, but there is that. I mean, Nashville's got a great vibe. It's a great city. Superficially, there's a lot in common between Nashville and Indianapolis. About the same size, similar built form.
On
You know,
65.
a lot. I mean, I could make a list of differences, and they sort of balance each other out. But the one difference is, Nashville, you have to be in the Sun Belt to become a boom town, basically,
Mm,
and it's just Sun Belt enough, and it really has taken off, and it's attracting people from all over the country. There's an energy there. You feel like you're part of something. You, it's probably like in the 1980s or 70s Atlanta, when you think that the city is really like coming up and big ambitions. Whereas here in Indianapolis, it's still kind of Hoosier Middle America. Far fewer people moving from out of town, and it's not we don't have the same thing going on by a mile. Not that we have great quality of life, many of the same amenities, etc. But the
you don't
the
have the hype.
vibe, the energy, we don't have that.
Yeah.
That's just we. I like to say good things about my city, but we also have to be realistic. I have to be completely fair and call them like I see them. And Nashville, I think, does have that kind of great vibe. It's one of the places that you sort of view. There aren't that many places in America sort of viewed as like high opportunity, cool cities, and Nashville is one of them.
Hmm. Well, let's change gears a little bit. And I'm curious about like how you would categorize. I guess we'll just categorize Nashville in terms of like the tier of city that it is. I mean, you talk about New York as being, I can't remember what the term is, but New York is obviously stands by itself among American cities, and then there's a tier below that: Boston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, these areas. Where would you place Nashville in that hierarchy?
Well, this is definitely one of the perennial debates, tiers of cities. A lot of
Right.
the objective, quantifiable research on tiers of cities has been done by people who are studying what they call global cities or world cities. Sociologist Saskia Sassen wrote a book, The Global City, did a lot of this research. And in those, always New York and London are number one and number two.
Hmm.
Sometimes London's at the top, some of New York. So it's like New York and London, there's nothing like that. Then you go to the next level, it's Paris, it's Singapore, it's Tokyo, it's Hong Kong, it's ones like that. And then you go on down the line. Now, within America, uh, if I were to create an urban hierarchy, I'd say there's four cities that are where the sausage is made. There are
Hmm.
four cities where America happens. It's New York, Washington D.C., San Francisco, and L.A. The share of the genuine elites and key institutions and decision-making venues in those cities is enormous. And of course, they're highly networked with each other. One reason they call it flyover country is because you're flying from
Hmm.
New York to Los Angeles or from one of these places. I think they stand apart from them, and then you could say there's kind of this next tier of places down. There's Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Miami, Seattle, and you can go on down the line. Nashville is probably somewhere around the 30th largest metropolitan area in the country. It's got about 2 million people in it. The distribution of population, the cities by population, tends to follow something called Zipf's law.
Hmm.
So it's sort of a mathematical distribution. And don't ask me to explain what that is. You can go look it up on Wikipedia if you want. But Nashville, you would say, is a pretty down in the hierarchy. Like a third tier type
Yeah.
city. So if you try to get to like 2 or 3 tiers of cities, you could another way to think of it is there's kind of the coastal cities, the big coastal elite cities. Then there's sort of the next tier of business centers like the Atlantas and the Phoenix and the Denvers and those places. And then you get down to kind of the Nashville, Salt Lake City, Austin, etc. Nashville punches above its weight, I think, because it has cultural significance, because it's got a great brand, because it's growing so rapidly, and because it's the people who are moving there are primarily from out of state. They're pretty high wattage people, and I think increasingly you're starting to see. You've seen this for a while, but you're starting to see more, elite people move there. There's always been some celebrities living there, right? Some music people, different people living there. You see institutions moving there, like the Daily Wire, I believe, moved to Nashville from Los Angeles. And you see this with Austin, I think, even more. A lot of Silicon Valley dissident elite types, Elon Musk, John Lonsdale, Joe Rogan are there. There's some big time stuff, people starting to move to Austin. I think Nashville's not quite there at the Austin level, but more and more. So I think the thing is, if you're in Indianapolis and you're a company in Indianapolis and you want to recruit someone to come to your company, it's candidly difficult to convince someone to move to Indianapolis if they don't have a historic tie here. And that was the case in Nashville not that long ago, actually. Well, today that's not true. If you say the job's in Nashville, yes, there are going to be some people who don't want to leave New York. Yes, there are going to be people like that. You're not going to get everybody, but by and large, people are like, oh, yeah, at Nashville, awesome. In fact, I was talking to the guy who was the president of a local nonprofit there a few years ago. And what he told me is we actually have to be careful and really vet that the person we're interviewing wants the job and that they're not just taking this job because it's a way to get to Nashville and they're going to leave on us. We got to make sure that they're, and so that's like a different mentality. And so I think that really allows you to attract things like Amazon, like Oracle, because you can recruit there on a national basis to Nashville. You can't do that in Columbus, Ohio, or Kansas City. Probably not even to Salt Lake City in a lot of these places. But Nashville, you can really do, I think, have a national draw for talent. And so that gives you a leg up, I think, on a lot of other places in terms of, attracting businesses like Alliance Bernstein from New York, for example.
So speaking of, I think they moved here a couple of years ago. One of the COO ran for mayor this past time. Am I still there? There we are.
You are still there.
Speaking of attracting talent, I enjoyed your essay or your comments in response to Matthew Iglesias identifying issues with Chicago, and you were saying they missed the point, and that Chicago's main problem is not being able to attract A-level talent and instead attracting B-level talent. And
yes, that caused quite a stir. And I think I got millions of views on that tweet. And it's weird. It's obvious Chicago is very sensitive to things like that. So the point I made about Chicago was like, look, Chicago, I got to be honest with you. And, with all due respect to Nashville, if I were a young person coming out of college, here's what I'd say. Can you make it on Wall Street or Silicon Valley? If the answer is yes, go there.
Right.
Do you want to be in a business that requires you to be in a particular city, like government, in DC? You want to be involved in the political world there? Go there. Anybody else should move to Chicago because Chicago is right now the best deal by far in urbanism. You get to live in a real big city with real culture, real amenities, real urban environment, real transit for less than you would pay to live in Nashville.
Right.
It's incredible, like what a deal it is. And if I were given I would probably move to Chicago before I'd move to Nashville. But nevertheless, I lived in Chicago a long time, and then I moved to New York, and it's like when you move from Chicago to New York, you start realizing like, oh, I always knew New York was like a bigger, more important city, but you don't realize how much bigger and how much more important until you go there and you start realizing like, wow, there are levels that, you didn't know existed. Maybe it's like the Masons where there's all these degrees you didn't even know exist until you get to a certain place. And you start realizing like, wow, New York is as far above Chicago as Chicago is above Indianapolis.
Right.
And so that's my point is like, Chicago It's great urbanism, great quality of life. It does have some genuinely globally elite institutions like the University of Chicago and Chicago Mercantile Group and all these things. But it's kind of the catchment area of kind of Big Ten talent. So the people who move to Chicago are Midwest farm boys like me. We roll off the farm. We go to our Big Ten school. I went to Indiana University. Then you move to Chicago. There aren't a huge number of children of hedge fund people who went to Harvard now moving to Chicago. And in fact, the profiles of those people who live in Chicago, their kids are not going to staying in Chicago. Like I said, so Chicago, maybe it's a little, maybe the exact grades aren't right. Like, look, the elite talent is in those big four cities that I mentioned, especially New York. That's where the A plus talent in America is. And you go to Chicago, yes, there are individuals who are A plus talent for sure. And there are some entities like the University of Chicago that are world class, but they are not, they are not building a Silicon Valley type platform player like even Seattle was, in terms of, Microsoft and Amazon and just not building them. And so, I think it's an inhibitor of their economy for sure and their ambitions as a city. This idea of we're the second city, like they want to view themselves as being in the club with New York and LA and all those cities. And the truth is they're really not in that league. They're not quite in that league. And they really, really, really hate it if you tell them that. Now, I think Nashville probably has a similar talent base to Chicago in that regard.
You were saying Chicago attracts Big Ten. This is like the SEC catchment area.
Well, I mean, it's like, it's sort of a catchment area. You have a national draw, maybe a bigger national draw than Chicago, but it's probably the classic person probably moving to Nashville is someone who maybe they worked in Silicon Valley or they were living in LA. They're now in their 30s. They're probably plateauing in what they're going to achieve. They're not going to become the Hollywood star. They're not going to become, the president of a think tank. They're not going to start the huge startup. They're not the elite AI engineer. They're not going to be the hedge fund manager. And they decide to step off the escalator. So that's what happens. That's what happens. I mean, your life, you move to the big city when you're young. It's like graduate school. You go there, you get these great experiences, you build your network, maybe you get married, you leave, and you end up, typically people exit those places. That's one reason they all have structural outmigration. And so, I think there is a sense. And then where do you go? You go someplace where you can afford to buy a house. I'm 35. I'd like to own a house. Where am I going to go? I'm going to go to Nashville because I'm never going to own anything. Maybe I'll own a studio apartment in Manhattan, and that studio apartment that I'm going to be strapped to pay for the rest of my life, I can't raise a family there. It's like too small for me. And it doesn't have laundry in the unit. And, it has a window air conditioner, and there's no garbage disposal. And by the way, that's true. I mean, most apartments in New York don't have garbage disposals, don't have central air conditioning, and don't have laundry. So, so you start looking at that like, man, Indianapolis is looking kind of good. My wife and I are both from Indianapolis. We got a sick kid. Like, when I lived on the Upper West Side, that was a classic Strollerville. Tons and tons and tons of kids. And yet they were almost all 5 and under. So when we had a kid, somebody asked, "Are you guys going to leave New York?" I said, "There's no plans to leave New York, but odds are we'll become a statistic." And so sure enough, that happened. So, we moved to Indianapolis. That's where we're both from Indiana. And it's great for us. It's perfect. It's even cheaper than Nashville. And loving it. But you move to a place like Nashville when you do that. You take the step back off of you kind of get out. And it's like a pyramid. It's like a professional services firm, Only a handful of people are going to stay there and truly make it to the top.
Of course.
And only a few people are so diehard that they're willing to put up with that stuff. So the people who are not like super elites end up sort of boiling off and moving to the Nashvilles, the Austins, etc. I mean, most of the people moving to Austin are not Elon Musk. There are people who are taking a step back from the most aggressive Silicon Valley startup lifestyle.
Right.
And in fact, I think it's changed a little bit, but not that long ago, Silicon Valley was not like, Austin was not this like massive startup mecca. And my guess is Nashville is not a startup mecca either.
Mm,
Nashville is where they're putting a operations center for Amazon,
right.
and they're putting us an Oracle facility. It's where, you could put your 10,000 person back office and call center in Austin if you're Apple, and you can get good people to move there and enjoy it. But again, it's not where the next iPhone is being engineered.
Of course.
Or something like that. And so, Nashville to me really falls kind of into that category and probably is unlikely to break out of it, to be honest. It's very, very, very difficult to disrupt the top of the hierarchy in America. I mean, New York has been the biggest city in America since the very first census. It's been number one since America became a country. Now, originally, you could say there was Philadelphia, there was Boston, but very quickly, New York became number one, and it's hard to disrupt number one. And there's a lot of churn further down the league tables, but it's very hard to disrupt number one. And again, the physical environment of New York is just so different, and it's in the size of it. Again, the Zipf's law. There's one city that's like twice as big as the other cities. I mean, again, I don't know what the whole distribution is, but you're the one at the top. You have a lot of advantages.
Yes,
and it's hard to fall back down.
What you're talking about migrating back to a town like Nashville after you plateau. I don't know if this necessarily applies to me, but because I'm from Nashville, but I was in Los Angeles working in entertainment until COVID hit, shut down the whole industry. I hadn't been out there long enough to be able to like weather the year-long pause in production they had. So I moved back to Nashville. It was like about the only thing. I didn't have the resources out there to weather the halt in production out there and like find other stuff. It just would have stretched my network to its breaking point. It was just not worth the effort for me to stay out there. So I don't know. That's an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and what would have happened during these strikes? If you're out there too.
Oh yeah,
there's a whole genre of leaving New York essays.
Yeah.
And the granddaddy of them all, which may have been written in 1962, it was written in the 60s by Joan Didion. It's called Goodbye to All That, which I think was originally the name of a Robert Graves novel, but she called it Goodbye to All That, and you can download it off the internet. Somebody has posted on the internet, and it's well worth reading to anyone who's in one of these coastal rat rate cities. She has this line that she talks about walking into a revolving door and walking out the other side 8 years later. She's like, I know now, as I did not know then, that it is entirely possible to stay too long at the fair. And it is. People can stay too long and, miss their ramp to get married.
Yep. Yeah.
And like a lot of things can happen, and, you keep trying to make it when you're not going to make it.
Right.
Kind of thing. And some of that is not about talent or about that. It's about luck, or it's about connections. When one of the things you start realizing when you get to New York, and much more than I noticed in Chicago, because again, I was in a different world, and I was in the think tank world. I was in a more elite world in New York, just in my milieu of business, compared to, my work in technology and management consulting in Chicago, where I was surrounded by the kind of Big Ten farm boys, these Midwest farm boys. You realize, oh, wait a minute. 3/4 of these people have connections. They come from money. They come from, people who are people. And there was an old newspaper. It was a weekly paper in New York called the New York Observer. It was sort of a gossipy lifestyle paper. The column that was the basis for the Sex and the City movie originally was published in the New York Observer. And what I loved about it is they didn't just tell you like the headline of something. They told you who all these people were. So they would be talking about the Whitney Biennial, and they're talking about the 35-year-old guy who's curating that. And I'm like, man, how did this 35-year-old guy get to be put in charge of that? And then they start telling you about his family. You go, oh yeah, his mom was an heiress.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
and his dad was, the former governor or something like that. You start realizing like, oh, wait a minute. Who there's a lot of carefully crafted backstories that people tell about themselves, highly edited,
course.
about how they got where they are, and you realize it ain't true. So you can have all the talent in the world, and yes, people make it. But sometimes you got to get lucky. It's not enough to be good. You also have to be lucky. And
Yes.
if that doesn't happen in a place like New York, then if you keep trying to push it and not realize that your window kind of closed a little bit, you can do some damage to yourself.
Definitely. Yeah. That's
Better
a
off
great
moving to
point.
Nashville. Getting
Yeah.
a real job.
I mean, part of it is like thinking about part of like the thing that made me stay was realizing that I grew up in Nashville, so if I have connections anywhere, it's in Nashville. So
Right.
I'm probably better off utilizing those.
Right, and you're familiar with the culture. I mean, that's one of the things about being in Indiana is like this is a home. I'm in a familiar culture. My family is here. Of course, when you have children, that counts for a lot. And it's good to be on kind of like home turf.
Of course.
I think it has some value.
So change gear again. You recently wrote this great piece on El Salvador and kind of Nayib Bukele's efforts to improve the country. You put a heavy caveat in there, which I understand why there is a bit of this love affair that a lot of people on the right have with Bukele because of how aggressively he's cleaned up the country. So I don't want to focus on. I'm doing that caveat for you because I knew that you probably delivered that anyway. But what I find interesting about the way you presented his political platform was he's a populist with a vision for how to actively improve people's lives, and he's focusing on infrastructure projects. And like one thing that stuck out from his portfolio of improvements is way that he sold building a hydroelectric dam and not talking about it being for climate purposes or anything like that. He spoke directly to it bringing power to more people. Something that is almost entirely lacking from American politics, and I was wondering why you think that no one has tried to run a campaign like this, and if someone has, who's been most effective doing it.
Yeah, well, Bukele is a former marketing executive. Okay, so he's basically a hype man.
Right.
I mean, that's his background. He was the president of his family's marketing company, and so I look at like, how is this guy selling himself? And you always got to keep in mind, he subtitles everything in English, and he tweets a lot in English. Yep. He wants the world to see what he's doing. So who knows what he's actually doing or what he's actually accomplishing? But let's just look at his marketing campaign. How does he portray himself? And everybody really focused in on his prisoner videos of all the purported gang members that he rounded up.
Right.
That's what really became an international sensation. But what I'm really struck by is how many videos he posts of himself building things. Mm-hmm. He just christened a new national library. He just, christened a new hydroelectric dam. He redid the airport terminal. He boasts of all the paved roads he's doing. He had another video of the 2 hospitals that had started construction. And so he's definitely populist. He's complaining about the corruption of the elites, which is definitely a populist trait, their incompetence. In fact, apparently the dam had been started under prior administrations. It hadn't gone anywhere, according to him. Like, I fixed it, I got it done. It was expensive, but I thought about canceling it, but it was going to cost as much to cancel it, to complete it. And now I'm going to cut your electricity effective immediately by like 9% or 16% or something like that, because we're going to have all this cheap power. And he really is portraying himself as a master builder and as someone who is delivering tangible improvements, material improvements in the quality of life of the citizens of the country. And doing it in a way that is first class. I mean, he brags about, I redid the public plaza with marble and granite because we want the public to be as good or better than the private. Mm-hmm. And he told this story about, how Rome and Greece and Athens and how the public buildings and the public spaces where they put their money, that the private houses were nice, but the public spaces were better. And we're looking at this as a generational trust and all of this stuff. And I'm like, The American right loves this guy, but American populists aren't like this. I mean, American populism is sort of like a carnival show. It's
Yes, yeah.
and it's interesting. Donald Trump. His mythos was that he was a builder, and if you go back, I think it's even in Art of the Deal. He talks about rebuilding Woolman Rink, which is an ice rink in Central Park, that the city had been trying to rebuild it for years. And he's like, I'll tell you what, you let me run it and I'll get it done in like 6 months. And sure enough, he did. And he built, of course, Trump Tower. And he did a bunch of real estate projects. He doesn't really do too many real estate projects today. He sort of just rents his name out to people. But his point is, he never really ran claiming he was going to build much. He's like, I'm going to bring back the jobs. I'm going to do this stuff. The one thing he said he was going to build was a wall, and he couldn't build it, much less make Mexico pay for it.
Yeah.
He couldn't get an infrastructure bill passed, something that, oh, by the way, Joe Biden actually managed to do. And so he didn't really talk that much about building, nor did he actually competent at building anything. And you look at American populist, it's almost entirely about cultural issues. Mm-hmm. Very little. I think there's this sort of idea that a lot of these, the Compact Magazine people or some of the other ones, American Compass, these sort of reformist conservative groups have this idea that what we need is a sort of a industrial policy. We're going to have a multiracial, working class movement. But that's not really what populism in America has turned out to be. It's sort of kind of a personality cult, and it's very focused on identity issues around things like immigration, for example, than it is trade policy. But even trade policy and industrial policy has very little to do with, tangible improvements in quality of life. An analogy might be, okay, great. We're going to shut down fentanyl and we're going to shut down this opioid. We're going to really make a big dent in the opioid crisis.
Right.
And we're going to reverse this life expectancy decline or something. Who knows? And it's, so American populism really doesn't promise a whole lot in terms of tangible benefits. If you go back to earlier generations of populists, they did. Huey Long in Louisiana, built like 13,000 miles of roads. He gave free textbooks to everybody in the state. He was building a ton of stuff. And you can go, of course, he was probably very corrupt, many other things like populists often are, but he actually delivered a lot of physical goods. People don't realize FDR was a populist. Mm-hmm. Yes, he was a patrician, but the idea, I think the classic Caesar character is someone from the patrician class who essentially acquires power over his class by allying with the people, forging a direct connection with the people. And that's what he did. He had his fireside chats. He was a man of the people. He was a very, he really was as close to an American Caesar as we ever had. He was even president for life. I don't think people really think about that. He basically violated the norms of serving 2 terms, and he was a president for the rest of his life. He reshaped all the institutions of society. But what did he do? He had, the WPA, the PWA, the CCC, all these things. And, I was just, my wife and I, just after Thanksgiving, we went hiking in a state park with our family, and, we're reading about the state park, and they're talking about how the Civilian Conservation Corps built all these projects in that park, and that we're still living off the legacy of things that he built. So the populists of days past, yes, some of them were interested in monetary policy or other things, but there was an element of building. And today, we don't have anybody that can build. I was just reading in Politico today that there were $7.5 billion allocated to build electric vehicle chargers in one of these infrastructure bills or the IRA or one of them, and there hasn't been a single one built yet.
Yeah,
2 years after this thing, 2 years after we put out $7.5 billion, we haven't built a single charger yet. I'm like, why don't you just give the money to Tesla and let Elon Musk build these chargers? He's the only one that's proven he knows how to build chargers at scale. So why wouldn't you just give it to him? I don't know. But we can't do anything today. We can't build anything, and we don't aspire to build anything. And so I just thought it was really interesting that American populists love Bukele, but American populism is not running on the same platform that he's running on. Right. He's running on, I'm going to build things. We're going to make, we're going to make El Salvador great. and we're going to have great airports, we're going to have great libraries and great beaches, and we're going to have a safe country. And again, the reality, I've never been to El Salvador, probably never will go to El Salvador, but I'm just telling you, that's how he's marketing himself.
I was there a month ago or 2 months ago in
Did
August.
you pay your visa fee in Bitcoin?
No, I could have though. And you did hear from people there how much safer it was. We went and got dinner at this place in downtown San Salvador, and ran into these older men that were leaving the restaurant at the same time as us, and it was like this wealthy French man and this Canadian, and they had been going to El Salvador. They've had a home there for X years or something like that. They've been going there a long time, and he told us that they used to have to ride to this restaurant with 2 armored vehicles flanking their own vehicle, and that they wouldn't be able to park their car out front. They would have to, like, the driver would circulate the car, and because of I guess how rampant gang violence was. Now they like drive up to the restaurant, park in the street, and go up there. So I think it's been pretty transformative for residents there.
Well, he's the most popular politician in Latin America.
Yeah.
He's got a 90% approval rating.
Right.
And I mean, that's reported in, mainstream reputable press in the United States. So if they're wrong, then I don't feel too bad about this. I'm not quoting the El Salvadoran press agency there. It's widely known that he's very popular.
So this kind of ties into one of the pieces that you wrote that I think about a lot, and it was based on Peter Thiel's speech that he gave. I can't remember where it was. Well, actually, I've got it pulled up here. Where was it? It was at. It looks like it was just at a Stanford Computer Science Institute something. He's talking about his how he inadvertently propelled Rigoberta Menchú to the Nobel Peace Prize because he kind of played the heel and was like the foil to her path to success. And what we were just talking about, populism in the U.S. increasingly just kind of looks like playing the heel constantly. And right. I don't know. I think about that a lot because it's pretty tempting to fall into playing the heel with a lot of issues that come up. Like when I encounter some of the rhetoric around things as benign as zoning laws or even transit, some of the rhetoric that's used to promote these things, like for example, I mean, this is just an excerpt off Twitter, but I think it just captures the spirit of how these people talk about these things. This guy was lamenting that people in Nashville don't believe that a bus system can work because of all the issues that we've already discussed at length, the way the city's set up, etc. And his whole his takeaway from that was not, well, maybe we should think about what solution we could craft to Nashville's unique challenges. It was, we need to make them believe that the bus is the right way, or that they should ride the bus, or some other such thing. And when I encounter that kind of rhetoric, I want to play the heel. I want to be like, I kind of, my impulse is to lean into that and play the heel. But I don't know. I was hoping you could kind of elaborate on this idea of the heel, and as we're talking about populism in the U.S., focusing on cultural issues, a lot of it does seem to be just playing the token villain and kind of ineffectively advocating for whatever you think you're advocating for, but more giving the other side justification for their actions. So anyway.
Right. So I will, I'll give my thoughts on this, and we have to start wrapping up. Because of my availability here. But what I'd say is, of course, that term comes from professional wrestling, where there's like two guys. The hero is the face, and the bad guy is the heel.
Right.
And the key is, you can get a big following on social media and get a lot of clicks and get a lot of attention by acting like the heel, by acting like a bad guy, by acting like a provocateur.
Right.
It's a great way to attract attention. And in fact, social media, all of the incentive structures of social media encourage you to do this. And the reality is, if you're a conservative, and I'm really aiming at conservatives with this, the media has a narrative, right? And the narrative, just like a professional wrestling script, has a good guy and a bad guy. And so they need some people to act like the bad guys, to do something the bad guys, so you can slot you in. They've got a bad guy heel role ready, scripted for you in their media article.
Yes.
All you have to do is do something that lets them put your name on it. And so, I think the paradigmatic, example of that is what happened on January 6th, something like that. And what you see is, a lot of people, especially in the MAGA influencer world, basically operate in this way. They're very provocateurs. They're trying to be a little bit the bad guy, kind of maybe even outdo themselves in trying to be the bad guys. And you can build a great business doing that, but ultimately you're kind of building a ghetto in a little bit, and you're alienating as many people as you're winning over. The guy who, of course, sums as the paradigm of the guy who likes to play the heel is Donald Trump. I would say the difference with Donald Trump is Donald Trump was actually in the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. He's actually world class at media. Donald Trump may be one of the handful of guys who knows how to lean into being the heel and make it work for him. But you're not at that level, right? For most people, it doesn't work. And so, yeah, being, flogging conspiracy theories and QAnons and like showing up and, heckling the school board and doing all that kinds of stuff, you can get a lot of attention for that. If you want to get yourself in the paper, go, show up and heckle your school board. If you want to, maybe it'll help you raise money. Again, you could build a great career off of doing something highly provocative, especially if it's entertaining. But even if it's not, but is that really going to move the needle on the public? A lot of times it doesn't. A lot of times it just turns people off. Normal people don't like a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Normal people really just wish things would go back to normal and they could start watching the NFL and like grilling brats and drinking beer. They don't want to, they want to pretend like all these controversies in the schools don't exist. And so that's just sort of a background right there. And so when you show up at your suburban school district, with Moms for Liberty or one of these groups and start going crazy, you alienate as many or more people than you bring over. And I think, there's a place for being the heel. And as I said, sometimes I need to be willing to be more disliked. I think a lot of us maybe err on the side of wanting to be liked too much. But if you look at sort of the center right and even the online right and MAGA right, what do you want to call all of them, way overweight towards provocateurs and people who, again, turn off as many people as they do. They're showboaters. And they delight in being the bad guy, like Matt Gaetz, for example, in Congress. I'm going to get rid of, McCarthy, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get on TV and all that stuff. And, again, it's good to have some of that. You got to have some of that. There's a role for that. But the problem is, where are the serious people? I'm not seeing any serious people.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And the average person, is very alienated by many of the things that a lot of these people do. And of course, the left also, there's a lot of people on the left who likewise do mean a lot of this, pro-Hamas stuff that's going on right now, alienating a lot of people. At the same time, the left has vastly more institutional backing, wealth, power, et cetera. You can get away with a lot more. They're not likely to do to them quite what they would do to you in an equivalent situation. So I do think it's something that, America is hungry for bold, competent, serious, mature leadership, which we don't have. The so-called respectable class, just to bring it back to the beginning, they're failing our country because they're timid. They're scared of their phony baloney jobs, which we can all see. Mm-hmm. They never step out of line on anything like DEI or anything. It's just like all of them genuflect to every single idea that's out there. And when the winds shift, they shift. They don't pick anything off the menu. They can't install a charger, an electric car charger, much less anything else. And so they're not getting the job done. But I think it's important to understand that kind of the insurgent right's not getting the job done either.
Yeah.
And so we need people who can actually get things done, who can lead, who can improve our country in tangible ways, who are willing to speak out and speak the truth, and not capitulate to the crazies, and just do it. We should build a wall.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't we build a wall?
Yeah,
because the southern border is crazy right now. I mean, and this is not like it's not like immigration, getting a handle on immigration is some kind of unique thing. In Denmark right now, the center left government of Denmark has adopted an immigration restrictionist policy. Mm-hmm. So there are people around the world doing this. If we're going to have immigration, it at least has to be controlled through some process, and we can't just have what we're having here. So we need people to do things, right? And it's not all right-wing stuff, it's not all left-wing stuff, but we have to actually fix some of these things. Mm-hmm. And so, unfortunately, the incentive structures of social media and others select for people who don't want to do that. So, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, Aaron, I appreciate great conversation. Appreciate you coming on. Have a good rest of your night. And,
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Of course. All right. Well, that was Aaron Renn. I guess Whit Smith is not showing up. I'm going to have to berate him later about that. What we'll do now is we'll run through the previous week at the Pamphleteer. I've got a slideshow, but I'm just going to pull up the website, which is a good opportunity to remind you guys that if you're not signed up for our daily newsletter, you should go to pamphleteer.co and sign up for it. Let's see what we got here. Like I said, I didn't have anything planned for this segment, so I'm just going to kind of flick through. Oh, actually, this is good. So Sandra Sepulveda, sitting councilwoman, blocked me on Twitter or X. This may seem kind of benign, but I kind of have, I'm going to have more of a fun time with this over the next couple of days. This was all in response to participatory budgeting, where they opened up voting to non-citizens and, illegal immigrants, basically, and people as young as 14 to vote on how to allocate $10 million of ARP funds. And here's the question I got blocked by her for, which is illegal, by the way, according to, there was a case brought against Donald Trump when he was president for blocking people, and they determined that if a political official runs a social media account, they are not allowed by law, it's a violation of the First Amendment, to block constituents. She's it's a benign question. I didn't threaten her with violence or anything. She blocked me, and so, I've had kind of fun with that. Let's see what else I put on there. There was some other stuff that I said to her. Oh, yeah, here we go. Yeah, attention, if you or a loved one have been blocked by a sitting Metro Council member, you may be entitled to compensation. Being blocked by an elected official is a rare but serious side effect of free speech. This is kind of a corny thing that I was trying out, but don't wait. Reply to the tweet today and tell us your story. There's a whole host of people that she's blocked. So that was one thing that happened this week that we wrote about. Let's see what else. The Tennessee Lookout put out this article about, let's see, where's the headline? Here it is. Put out this article, Tennessee's prison population grows as violent crime drops steeply. Let's think about that for a second. As the prison population goes up, violent crimes drop. That's kind of how it's supposed to work. But, I mean, this article is just filled with beautiful lines like, criminal justice reform advocates said they were disheartened but unsurprised by the data. Everything that we said was going to come true has come true, said Dawn Harrington, executive director of Free Hearts, a nonprofit that advocates for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. So, the essential conceit with this is that progressives that support soft on crime policies are okay with increasing crime. The cycle that we repeat constantly is that we know how to solve crime. You put the people, remove them from society that are committing most of the crimes. It's not that complicated. This is not rocket science. But after a period of doing that, I mean, I get the 90s we saw kind of a depression in homicides, and we've recently seen it tick back up as soft on crime policies have spread around the country, and we're about to have a similar backlash where maybe there's a return of common sense where we lock up the people committing the crimes. The point is that the progressives that are involved with nonprofits like this ultimately do not care about the level of criminal activity and are completely unconcerned. In fact, I would argue they even know that what they're doing will make crime go up, and they're just negligent of that fact. So I found this article is hilarious, and it actually echoes this columnist in the 90s for the New York Times named Fox Butterfield, who printed a whole host of articles with almost identical headlines about crime in New York City at the time. More inmates despite drop in crime, similar to our article that we just looked at. Number in prison grows despite crime reduction. Just kind of a refusal to put together 2 and 2 and realize that they make 4. Wall Street Journal columnist James Taranto coined the term in response to this kind of like refusal to just accept that, or to even, I don't know if it's a deliberate effort to deny the fact that more people in jail probably leads to lower crime for obvious reasons. He coined the term the Butterfield fallacy, which consists of misidentifying as a paradox what is simple cause and effect. More criminals in jail, less crime. It's not complicated. And Anita Wadhwani at the Lookout made the same fallacy. So yeah, that's the kind of people that you got involved in making decisions around here. Let's see, Big Show. That's about it. We've got a fun week coming up. Megan will be on her show tomorrow, Nashville Savvy at noon, and then Jared's got his show Friday. Jared will be talking to Ian Pryor, who was kind of at the center of the Fairfax County, or was Loudoun County or Fairfax County? Let's pull that up real fast. Ian's an interesting guest, very well spoken. Wrote a book about his experience. Let's see, I can't remember if it was Loudoun or Parents of the World Unite. We're publishing a book review of his book tomorrow, and Jared's going to be interviewing him on his show. I just want to make sure I get it right. Fairfax. It was in Virginia, in the middle of COVID, when parents were suddenly came to the realization that their kids were getting taught some pretty insane things in schools, and he chose to mobilize against it. So that should be an interesting conversation. That's on Friday. That's all for our show today. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next week. Talk to y'all soon.